How do you do? This is Trixie, the Golden Witch, ranting, raving, Ota Queen, and Mother of AniTube, and this is ASE Presents Yig Studios Vlogust. We're in celebration of my 31st birthday. I'm doing a vlog every single day, all month of August. And this one is not a vlog per se. There's this vlog segment at the start to explain it, but actually this is going to be a clip from the podcast that I did with Matt vs. Japan. Matt vs. Japan is an absolute expert of the Japanese language. He has an extremist self-taught system of like how to learn Japanese on your own, with or without college education, and at incredible speeds by just full commitment to the idea of like doing nothing but learning Japanese, basically. And he is just in the process right now of moving to Japan himself because he has been guesting on Japanese television based on the stuff that he does, like man on the street bits and stuff that he's been doing. I have known about him for quite some time. He's been a fan of mine for a long time. He had asked me to collaborate before, and I just never really knew what kind of collaboration to do with him because our content styles are pretty different. But after he got into contact with ASE Presents, then we figured out that we could do an interesting podcast talking specifically about translation, about learning Japanese, about how much Japanese you can learn from anime, how much learning Japanese affects your view of anime and of manga and your ability to consume that stuff. There's also a segment where we do a little game show. Cranberry Dave, the producer and leader of Sucker Punch, the hip-hop group that I'm a part of, that you can find links to all of our stuff down in the description or on Spotify, he put together a little quiz of Japanese cultural knowledge to ask me, Matt, and Mint Salad, who guests on this episode as our sort of control, the person who knows nothing about Japanese or Japan, and so we can explain everything to her, and she learned a ton from this podcast. I learned a lot. Matt had a great time. I'm really glad that he has supported this show so much, and he's said that he will do like any translation work that I need. This is a highlight clip from the podcast. You can find the full podcast again on the ASE Presents channel. It is part of the new Void Gazers podcast series. This is just a segment from that episode because it's an hour and a half long and it's already up on another channel. So anyway, enjoy this, and if you enjoy it, enjoy that. Thanks again for watching, and I'll see you in the next one. I've been at the level for a while of I can watch shows for babies. I can maybe handle some Pokemon without subtitles, but I'm working my way up. Also, a good strat. You can find like live streams of Japanese television. I've like just left TV Tokyo on all day a few times, and it's an interesting way to pick up on like what Japanese is being like it's probably the Japanese that is being heard the most is like whatever's being said on like the biggest channels in Japan, so like I feel like nothing could quite naturalize you from a distance as quickly as like just actually watching straight up Japanese TV broadcast.
True, although you'll have to sit through all the crazy sound effects and commercial jingles and all that stuff.
All that stuff. I love getting to watch the Japanese Takati ads and stuff that play on TV Tokyo. And they also will play like a lot of like Makoto Shinkai movies and stuff like that. Like there are certain anime that are mainstream enough that they actually just come on TV all the time,
That's cool.
Which is pretty fun.
One other thing I'll say, if you want a little sneak peek into like the underbelly of the Japanese learning community, that's not really, it's not anything bad or anything, but if you want to know like how hardcore some people go to try to optimize this process, so a lot of times people in the community, we talk about active immersion versus passive immersion. So active immersion is like when you're sitting down and you're trying to consume something in Japanese and you're giving your full attention to it. Whereas passive is kind of when you just leave it on in the background while you do something else. Like, if you go for a walk or you're making a sandwich, you just listen to Japanese in the background. And generally, we think about it that passive immersion is not as helpful or beneficial as active, but it still is worth something, especially when you combine it together. And so what I used to do, and what a lot of people do now, is you'll sit down and you'll watch an anime episode, let's say, and you'll kind of look up the words you don't know. You might make some flashcards, and at the end of it, people have created software where you basically input an anime episode file and the accompanying subtitle file, and it it spits out an MP3 file that basically used the timing information from the subtitle file to remove any dead space where no one was talking. So you have this condensed audio file where the entire thing only consists of dialogue. Like if there's ever an action scene where like basically anytime no one says anything for longer than like 5 seconds, then it will just cut out that whole portion. So like a 22-minute anime might get down to like 10 minutes in length, like 10, 13 minutes. And then they will listen to that on repeat passively in the background while they do other things. And because they already watched it once, you kind of know what's happening and you kind of can see it in your mind's eye. And it's just totally efficient because there's no dead space from like battle scenes or anything like that.
That is fascinating, and it's got me thinking about the idea, like, even removed from doing it that extreme where, like, you make it a 10-minute audio file, like, just watching the same episode over and over again, eventually you're going to know the layer, like, the first time you watch something when you don't understand Japanese, there's, like, an amount of you reading the subtitles to yourself inside your own brain, like, that drowns out actually hearing the Japanese, and that was the case for me for like a lot of my early anime viewing. Was like I wasn't really hearing what they were saying. I was hearing my own voice reading back to me. And then at some point when, it got to where I don't have to like read the subtitles because I process them more quickly and I'm like paying more attention to the dialogue, and it's more like the subtitles are a supplement, like to fill in the gaps of what I don't understand about what I'm hearing. But like, yeah, once you rewatch it and you already know the dialogue, you'll get to a point where like, well, I know what they're saying. I don't need subtitles. And yeah, like now you know what all those words mean because you watch the episode until you those just whatever words happen to be in that episode, you're going to know the definitions of after that much exposure. So that is a really interesting learning method for sure.
Yeah, like one of my, like the way that I learned is I combined that with, like, I made big use of the dictionary and a program called Anki. I don't know if if you're familiar with that software, but
I am not.
It's what's called a spaced repetition program or spaced repetition software, and it's the most famous. There's many different software that do the same thing, but this one is open source and free and the most used within the community. Basically, it's a program where you make your own flashcards, like you type out or copy and paste in what you want on the front of the flashcard and the back of the flashcard, and then when you review the software asks you, like, how well did you know this thing? Like, not at all, a little bit, pretty well, or it was easy. And it uses that feedback you give it to basically determine how often you should study each of your cards. And it has this algorithm so that it basically knows when the last time you reviewed something was and how well you know it. And it uses that to determine the next time that you should review it so that you don't forget anything. And so if you study with this and you review with it every day, then you can learn lots of words like really efficiently. So like what I personally did was I would make 10 of these cards every day, 10 new Japanese words. And I'd just be reading light novels or watching anime. When there was a word I didn't know, I would just take that whole sentence and put it on the front of a flashcard. And then I'd put the definition of the word on the back of the flashcard. So I'd make 10 of those a day. And then in addition to the 10 new cards, the program would assign me like 60 cards to review out of my collection. And some of those were cards that I hadn't seen for a week, some I hadn't seen for a month, some I hadn't seen in like multiple years. It's like keeping track of that for me. And I did that for 5 years straight, which led to me having over 15,000 cards. And at that point, I knew like more words than some Japanese people did.
15,000.
Wow.
Yeah.
Impressive.
But it's just 10 a day, right? It's all just about that consistency, doing a little bit every single day. And it just really adds up. And so for me, that's kind of like my specialty in Japanese is I have like this huge vocabulary now because like I would read like Bakemonogatari. I know every single word in Bakemonogatari. I've memorized every single one through this flashcard program. And so, and that's the funny thing is like there's a lot of Japanese words where like I can tell you exactly where I learned it. Like I could tell you the scene of the show that I learned it from because I have a flashcard for it. So it like is locked in my memory. So that was the way that I really did it. For me, it was a matter of like tons of input, like reading light novels, watching anime, and then I would make these just 10 cards every day out of the stuff I was consuming. And I got really good at understanding that way. And once I was really good at understanding, then speaking came pretty naturally because I just had to do that thing that I talked about earlier, where I just asked myself, okay, what would a Japanese person say in the situation? Yeah. And I'd seen so much input, my brain would naturally be like, oh, what about this? What about this? And so that's how I did it. But I have another friend who is just as good as me and better in some regards, and he didn't use any flashcards or use any dictionary. He literally just like watched an anime with subtitles, and then he'd immediately watch the same episode with no subtitles. And he just basically watched anime for like 10. He did that for like 10 hours a day for a couple years, and he got really good that way. So really the key is that you need to make the input comprehensible to you so that your brain can like learn to understand it. And you can do that with English subtitles, or you can do it with the dictionary like I did. There's like a lot of different options, but yeah, it just comes down to like get lots of input, understand the input, and then your brain does most of the work for you.
Yeah. Duolingo functions kind of similarly to what you were describing with the flashcards, where like it just keeps bringing stuff back up to you and like trying to reteach you like that stuff, you know. It's worked pretty well for me getting back into like remembering everything. Like I had within a couple days like caught up to where I had been in Japanese 3 in high school, you know, like just because it was like relearning to ride a bike or whatever. Like, I haven't done this in 10 years, but how do you forget how to do it, you know? So like, yeah, it was like the feeling of like getting back into it, but I've been so busy I haven't actually kept up with it. So that's been the biggest thing holding me back from learning Japanese, is always just I prioritize other things too much, you know, like it definitely takes a level of determination and like selecting it as the thing you're going to do. I would say like, you know, the reason that like, cause I've known about your sort of full immersion methodology for a while. And I've always thought like, well, that's obviously the best way to learn Japanese fast. I just have to like make space in my life to actually do that. And that's like sort of the challenge that you propose to people right up front, is like, look, don't even tell yourself you're going to do this unless you understand that you have to spend 10,000 hours on it.
Yeah, totally. And that's why I think like most of the people in the community who are like me and have succeeded, they generally had a period of time in their life for a couple years when it was almost all they were doing. Like they were just obsessed with it, and they did everything else in their life, the bare minimum, to spend as much time as possible doing Japanese. And so a lot of times I get asked by people like, do I have to do that? Or can I be more moderate? Could I just do like 3 hours a day, 4 hours a day, which is still a lot to spend on a hobby every single day, right?
Yeah.
But it's still possible to have like a job and a life and cut out 3 to 4 hours if you're really dedicated. And I always answer to those people asking like, can I still get fluent that way? Like, I think you totally can. I just think that realistically it's harder. Like it's easy
harder,
to just
it'll take longer, and
yeah, I mean it's easier to do one thing all the time, and then because you don't have to manage your time, right? If all you do is Japanese, then you never have to ask yourself like, should I do Japanese right now, or should I hang out with my friend right now? The answer is always just no, I'll just do Japanese. And I also think that's why like monks, they go on meditation retreats where they just do nothing but meditate for like weeks or months in a row. I think that's just in a way it makes it easier. It sounds harder because it's like, oh, you're going so hardcore. But in a way, I think it actually is probably the easiest way, ultimately.
Yeah, I understand what you mean. It is the easiest way, and if you do it another way, you're making it hard for yourself, like, and you think you're, like, making space for it in your life, but really you're just taking away from your life to do something, not to the extent you could be.
Yeah, I mean, I don't want to discourage anybody to try that method, because, I mean, for a lot of people, it's just not an option to dedicate their life to it, right? And so their only option is to make time for it. So I totally think it's possible, and I would encourage anyone to do it. But just like
it's also not necessarily everyone's goals to be like to have your 15,000 word vocabulary either.
Oh yeah,
like,
of course. Yeah, I'm definitely an extreme example.
Yeah, like so if it seems intimidating, remember you don't have to be fully fluent to like move to Japan or like continue.
No. In fact, most people who live in Japan don't speak Japanese, and this is surprising to some people. I would imagine not surprising to you, but yeah, it's apparently. I mean, I hear this firsthand, but I also talk to a lot of people who've lived in. I mean, I hear this secondhand, but I talk to a lot of people who have lived in Japan. But people move to Japan. They make an effort to learn Japanese for a little bit, but then what happens is basically Japan is just a pretty easy country to live in, even if you don't know Japanese, because things are in English and they accommodate you. And so, like when I was in Japan, there was a teacher, an English teacher, who was American, and he had been living in Japan for 10 years, and he had a Japanese wife and half Japanese kids, and he spoke less Japanese than you do, Trixie. So
that's fascinating.
Like, yeah, don't think that going to Japan will automatically make you good at Japanese. Because the more likely scenarios, instead of getting good at Japanese, you get good at getting by without Japanese. It's like
That's hilarious.
by default,
Yeah.
you build the wrong skill. So it's kind of like if you can't get good at Japanese in America, you probably can't get good
won't get it, yeah.
in Japan either. That said, if you just want to live in Japan, like for example, PewDiePie, right? He's probably going to have an amazing time in Japan, and he's probably never going to get good at Japanese, but it doesn't really matter. So it just depends on your goals.
I'm really glad you clarified all that, and I think we're going to wrap it up here now. You can find me on the Yig Studio channel on @GoldenWitchFire on all social media platforms, and I'm all over this ASE Presents channel as well. Famous legendary hip-hop producer, Cranberry Dave, joined us earlier, and he produces the Sucker Punch music, which I am a part of, the supergroup. Mint, you're also in Sucker Punch, and we're in this podcast. I also am a part of the Jittery Zeitgeist hip-hop review podcast on this channel. So yeah, you need to be subscribed here. You need to be subscribed to Matt vs. Japan and Yig Studio, and follow all of us on Twitter. Matt, thank you again for joining us.
Yeah, thanks so much for having me. It was super fun.